Okay. Good afternoon. My name is EMANUEL PASTREICH, and I am the director of the Asia Institute here in Seoul, Korea. This seminar, I think, is perhaps one of the most important ones that we've had so far, to be led by Daniel Garrett, one of the more creative, energetic, and brave figures in American diplomacy.
Not much energy today.
A man who has, I think, fought very bravely for truth, justice, and the long-term interests of the United States, Korea, and I would say of the earth for many years. And he's been here with the Asia Institute for some time now, one of our loyal, thoughtful members. His talk today, Apocalypse Yesterday, the Climate Crisis as the Ultimate Boon for Innovation, is historic in every respect. As somebody, lone diplomat who sent out a general memo on climate change.
Two. Descent cables.
Descent cables, yes. Which gathered significant amount of attention, positive and
not good
otherwise. Did not endear him to all the powerful figures, but won him some respect in important places, and he continues his efforts. I met Daniel originally. I wrote an article about climate change and security. I published in Truth Out online in March 7th, 2013, 4 years ago, almost exactly. Article called On Climate, Defense Could Preserve and Protect Rather Than Kill and Destroy. And I proposed at that time that the largest part of the military budget should be committed to adaptation to and mitigation of climate change, and put forth the sort of the skeleton, which I'm still working on, of a systematic plan to meet that goal. And Daniel wrote back to me out of the blue, offering his support, and we've been working ever since together. By the way, on the occasion of that article, the head then of the Pacific Command, Navy Admiral Samuel Locklear, visited Harvard University just 2 days after the article came out to meet with a group of scholars, and he made a statement in which he identified climate change as the greatest threat, something which he was also roundly attacked for and is no longer in that position. But in fact, truth is truth, and there's nothing more valuable than simply stating it. There are a lot of think tanks in Washington, D.C. or in Seoul that soak up millions of dollars, and they use it to promote any number of weapon systems to respond to threats which are at best highly unlikely. And there's a whole pile of overpaid security experts who've made fortunes by catering to the needs to ply outdated weapon systems for yesterday's conflicts. And most of them are totally silent on this question of climate change, the greatest threat that humanity faces. That's right. Thousands of pages written about North Korean missiles, but not a word about the disaster which is killing the oceans and raising sea levels and turning Asia and South Korea, in fact, into a desert. Personally, I find that sort of responsible so irresponsible that I find it offensive, and I'd like to ask them all to resign. I just about had it. And I know how highly ranked those think tanks are, but it doesn't really impress me. We used the term in this talk, Apocalypse Yesterday, in a way which is not necessarily a joke. The crisis has already started. It's not something in the far future, and it's been going on, yet we still haven't formulated a real response. And I think ultimately we're going to have to say that the money for fighter planes and other weapon systems is simply not there, because the response is going to have to be just so massive, and we need to call upon intellectuals, professors, like I guess I'm a professor, lawyers, politicians, military officers, journalists, and others to stand up and identify these real issues for what they are, and get out of this security racket. I know it's fun to hang out with the big, important people, but it's really not our ultimate goal in life. I think the real success is to stand before God and say you did your best. So that's my short introduction. Let us welcome Daniel Garrett to the Asia Institute and look forward to his very compelling talk. Thank you.
These days, having had the good fortune to have served when I was a Foreign Service officer with the State Department in Nepal, I tend to begin greeting people with a namaste. It means that the divinity in me, if there is any, greets the divinity in you. But it's also a way of reminding myself something I've learned from the few times I've talked in Korea, and that is the nature of Korean audiences is such that normally everybody who's listening to me knows more than me. So I do ask your forgiveness when I say things which you probably have known as long as me, if not longer. I also want to say Hashidele, which is the Tibetan greeting for Happy New Year. Today is the Tibetan New Year. My wife is Tibetan, and Tibet is, in a way, the Tibetan Plateau is a case in point of what happens to a culture and an ecology as temperatures rise, because the alpine nature of the Tibetan Plateau is very, very sensitive, very delicate. And as we speak, the Tibetan Plateau, which is the source of water for 2 billion people in Asia, is rapidly turning into a desert. So, it's a beautiful day outside. We are fortunate to be alive, enjoying that beautiful day. And in order for us to enjoy more of it and each other, I'm not going to go into too much detail. Instead, I would like us all to consider a very simple analogy about what is happening now. Imagine that we're all in a speeding vehicle. When I say all, I mean all of humanity is in this vehicle. Now it's true, there are some individuals in the vehicle who don't get along very well with each other. And there is a major problem, and that is that about 20% of the people in the vehicle have 80% of the vehicle's resources. In other words, there's this massive unfairness. The vehicle is speeding toward a cliff. In fact, it's been accelerating its speed for the last 50 years. If we look at greenhouse gas emission, population, nitrous oxide, fertilizer use, pretty much anything that we can quantify since about 1950 has been going like this. In fact, it's called the Great Acceleration. What's interesting about the particular cliff that either we're going over very soon or we have gone over is that the faster we go, the deeper it gets. Now there have been people in the front with binoculars looking at the cliff, and they've been warning us about the cliff for 30 years at least. Hansen, the climate scientist at NASA, has briefed presidents in the Oval Office going way, way back. He's always consistently warned them about the same thing.
The Club of Rome, was that the...
Yeah. This is not a surprise what's coming. What is a surprise to me is the way we've reacted, which is too little too late. What do I mean by that? The Paris Agreement, I think all of us in some ways, thought was really quite beautiful. Getting back to that vehicle that carries all of humanity, despite these problems, I would have to say we mostly agree with each other. We mostly actually appreciate each other. We're one big, hilarious, very crazy, very beautiful family. It's a delightful vehicle that we can share with each other. So there is a lot of hope that we can get along. The problem, though, one of the problems, though, is that these people who have been warning about the cliff didn't really get listened to until it was maybe too late. So going back to Paris, that wonderful agreement stipulated that if we reduce our CO2 emissions by 80% by 2050, then we have a 50% chance of not going higher than a 2-degree increase. There's a couple of problems with that. First of all, we're talking about, in some senses, survival, and so a 50-50 chance, really, that's pretty bad. Would you guys stay in this building 1 minute more if there was a 50-50 chance of it collapsing? I don't think so. We would run for the door. But that's the situation that this quote-unquote hopeful Paris Agreement has put us in. The other problem, though, has to do with the way the 2-degree guideline was set. It wasn't set really by climate scientists. Climate scientists were talking about a 1.5 degree increase as being the maximum that was safe. Now, why is that? That's because at about 1.5 degrees, we know that some very important processes begin. And these processes cause other processes to begin, which cause other processes to begin. And pretty soon what we have initiated is what's called runaway climate change, in which the degradation of carbon sinks, of the parts of the Earth system which maintain our temperature, no longer begin to function. Instead, whatever human efforts we make to reduce CO2 emission are overwhelmed by the breakdown of the natural systems which have protected us so far. So that's why at Paris, there was an aspirational target of 1.5 degrees. Well, let's get back to 2 degrees. I just came from a small conference in Shanghai where there were a number of environmental economists and energy policy makers, and without exception, all of them said that we were not going to make the 2-degree mark. In fact, as I looked at their presentations and the energy mix which they expected quite confidently for 2050, it was still quite predominantly oil and gas. So we're not even going to make, by these conservative projections, a level which is already unsafe. There's another reason that Paris maybe in a way fooled us, and that is that the way in which they arrived at an 80% reduction by 2050 was based on certain assumptions. The assumptions had to do with what we call the carbon budget. In other words, how much can we burn and still stay below this limit? Unfortunately, it's probable for 2 reasons that the carbon budget figures that they used were much too optimistic. A recent meta-study of different calculations for the carbon budget to try and figure out why they were sort of different from each other came to the conclusion that we have about half the carbon budget that we thought we did. It's largely because of a problem called overshoot. In other words, there's a lot of momentum that's already in the system, and even if we, in terms of the physics of CO2 in the atmosphere, we get to what we want to get to, the momentum is going to cause what's called overshoot. But the other reason that those calculations were probably unrealistic has to do with the nature of the models that were used. They, by and large, were unable to incorporate nonlinear processes. So what's a nonlinear process? It means you have an input, but the output is different. You can't extrapolate in a linear way. What does that mean in terms of the climate? Well, it means these aforementioned positive feedbacks, like loss of ice, which means that the reflection of solar energy back into space is no longer as much as it was. That's not really adequately modeled. And certainly the biggest thing that isn't modeled is release of methane from the permafrost, which is, some people call it a carbon bomb, because if it is all released, it's equal to 20 to 30 years of all of the human emissions on the planet, which is a pretty big bomb if you're trying to keep the planet cool. But I'm going to get back to that later. If, though, we look at the way nature, the way the planet has responded to these things in the past, we notice that Earth system sensitivity, it's what it's called. I should back up, I'm sorry. Earth system sensitivity is the relation between the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere and how much the temperature increases. IPCC gives us a range of values. Nature, however, tends to prefer the high sensitivity. And this high sensitivity is a result of the fact that nature is active. And if one part of a system breaks, the connected system breaks, the connected system breaks. So you might be in a car and everything can be working, but if one part goes, chances are it's going to keep you from getting where you want to go. So nature consists of an incredible nested series of nonlinear systems all linked together. To make it simple, let's go back to our speeding vehicle analogy. So the cliff is, in the real world, it's 1.5 degrees. We don't want to go past 1.5 degrees because then it initiates a sequence of runaway climate change. But it turns out we have half the stopping distance, half the carbon budget that we thought we had. So that first point at which we might have been able to put on the brake, and we are trying to put on the brake, has probably, that first opportunity to make a better future for us or a less bad future for us has probably been lost. Some climate scientists will say we have a few years still to break, but that's usually what they'll say publicly. Privately, when everything is considered, the only way that theoretically, and at this point it's theoretical, that we could break and not go over that particular cliff is something like a wartime footing globally in which every non-essential industry was shut down as much as possible. And I'm asking you guys, is anybody going to do that? Certainly my country, with a madman who doesn't believe in climate change in the Oval Office, is not going to do that. So, we're going over that cliff. Now there's another possibility. Let's assume actually that we're all together in this. We've gone over the cliff. The good thing is that we have some absolutely brilliant people in the car with us. And we all want to live and they want to live. And there are a suite of technologies which maybe could help transform this vehicle from one that's going to hit hard into one which is a hovercraft, one which can fly, so that we miraculously don't hit the bottom. What are some of those technologies? Well, one thing that the IPCC pointed toward, called untested technologies, and essentially the last IPCC report was throwing in the towel on mitigation. These untested technologies, the major one is carbon from air. And it works. There's a large number of projects which have successfully demonstrated that this is possible. Some of them, in fact, turn carbon from air into things like carbon nanotubes, carbon fiber. So theoretically, we can harvest the carbon that's in the air and make a new 21st century infrastructure. There are other ways of getting the carbon from the air. Trees. So theoretically, we could embark upon a rapid forestation and afforestation program to cover as much of the planet as possible with vegetation. The bad thing about that idea, there are two drawbacks. One, estimations about how much time it would take to do that say it would be too slow. Maybe we would be able to complete that project by 2050. Now, I'm actually a little bit more optimistic. I've encountered ideas for basically planting acres and hectares of trees from the air. We could theoretically deploy armies of tree planting robots. But the other problem with that plan has to do with the nature of the way the planet is already changing. In other words, if we try to reforest a certain area with native trees, native plants, they may not survive because we've already initiated chaotic weather patterns. And so we would have trees which perhaps would encounter such long periods of drought that they would not survive, and or drought punctuated by rain bombs, these storms which are now typical because of the increased water vapor in the atmosphere, in which you have in 1 or 2 nights as much rain as used to fall in a year. This is a difficult kind of environment for trees to survive, and it's not to say that those problems couldn't be dealt with. For example, you could, along with massive planting of the trees, you could install water from air generators that would give the trees what they need in drought periods. So it's a possible Deus ex machina scenario if we ramped up worldwide a massive effort. There's another example of something which is a little less risky than other geoengineering schemes is seaweed farming. A good study has shown that if we converted about 9% of the ocean's surface area to seaweed, this would be extremely effective. Now, this is actually a very promising candidate for a number of reasons. Not only does the seaweed provide harvestable bioenergy and take carbon from the air, it also reduces ocean acidification. So it is theoretically possible that even though we have sadly gone over the cliff, that if we massively and rapidly deployed a number of these probably benign, because they're nature-based geoengineering schemes, that we could turn into a hovercraft. In other words, that we could avoid the hard hit. But we're not going to do that, I think. And the reason is the level of cooperation and investment that would be required is something that humanity probably won't agree to do until we've hit. Unfortunately, it seems to be the nature of the human imagination. So then we get to what I'm sad to say is probably happening, and that is we're going over this cliff of abrupt, nonlinear, runaway climate change. What is it going to mean? Well, if we look at what's happening in the Arctic now, the polar scientists that I've talked to, they're screaming as loud as they can that it's an emergency because they've never seen the kind of things that are happening up there that are happening now. Methane is being released from the permafrost. There is even some reports of what are called methane clathrates beginning to release methane. Methane clathrates are frozen methane deposits on the sea floor, sometimes on just off the coastal shelves at various depths. If they went, we're really, forgive my French, we're really screwed. A recent study seems to suggest, though, that there's a buffer to their release. The buffer has to do with the fact that as the methane is released from them, there's enough biolife in the intervening layers of the ocean to essentially digest it. So we may have some time. What I worry about with that particular paper is that it assumes basically a status quo in terms of ocean conditions. And in fact, the ocean, even the deep ocean, has been the greatest place that the heat has been accumulating. So I'm not sure if that assumption in that paper is something we should be sanguine about, we should be comfortable about. Is there an analogy to this abrupt climate change cliff? Most scientists point to what's called the PETM, which is the Pliocene-Eocene thermal max, when there was a big release of methane. And although initially it was thought that the release took place over about 1,000 years, there have been some more recent papers which have stood the test of observation because it's a radical hypothesis which they've put forth. But based on the fossil record, essentially, they're saying that no, the shift took place, a 5 degrees centigrade increase in temperature, which was the Pliocene-Eocene thermal max, took place over the course of 9 to 13 years. 9 to 13 years. What was the world like then? Well, we know again from fossils that above and below the Arctic and Antarctic circles, it was tropical. Not all life was extinguished in that event. There were life forms which survived, crocodiles in the Arctic. But in between, and of course, it was hot desert. Hot desert. Other global climate models looking at projections a little bit further down the road, 2050, 2060, 2070, on business as usual scenarios, all also paint a picture of all of the mid-latitudes of the planet facing perpetual drought. And when I say mid-latitudes, I mean up as far as the Korean Peninsula for sure. So that is a world that may be coming about very quickly, which some people feel we will not survive. I don't think that's true. I think that we, even when we hit, and what a grim talk this is, isn't it? I'm so sorry. But here comes the optimist part. So we've gone over the cliff. We did have technologies which might have kept us from hitting. We couldn't deploy them in time, and so we hit. We have a really rapid shift of the planet that becomes a new planet right under our feet.
This is like when? 20 what?
Well, I think we can start the clock ticking now.
So you think like 5 years or 10 years?
Well, if it's like the PETM event, then we have, let's say, 10, 15 years if we're lucky. The bad news, though, even worse than that, is that, I wish I had my slide, but if we look at the rate of change of the PETM in terms of release of methane, of greenhouse gases, compared to our release, ours is about 100 times faster. So theoretically, based on how much we've been pumping at what speed, this event could happen quicker. It doesn't mean, by the way, that it's going to be exactly like the PETM. The reason is that we're starting from two different states. We are in what's called a no analog state. In other words, our models are not really good enough to tell us exactly what's going to be happening. And the paleoclimatic models, although they can illustrate the rapidity with which it can happen, they're from an Earth at a different state. But basically, for the last, several hundred million years, we've been, if you think of attractors in phase space, we've been going like this, figure eights, back and forth. One state is a glacial state. It's the ice ages. And then because of these minor orbital perturbations, very minor, we will tip out into an interglacial period, which is what we're in now. We would normally be returning back to a glacial period, but we're not. What we have now instead done is we've escaped this system of two attractors, and we're in a new state, which people call the Anthropocene, because the greatest energy input to the Earth's energy system is us. It's you, it's you, it's you, it's you. It's particularly me as an American, because my carbon footprint is like an elephant compared to an Indian or someone in China. So we've left familiar territory, and we don't exactly know where we're going. But it's going to be dangerous for a bunch of reasons. Let's look at the most obvious reasons it's going to be dangerous. Quite frankly, the world's food system, as interconnected as we all are, I don't know what percentage of the food in Korea is imported, but I suspect, I suspect it's more than 50%. Anybody know the answer to that?
76%.
There we go. That supply is not something that you can depend on. A recent study said that the American Midwest, which is very productive, that given the nature of the climate chaos that's already in the Earth system, that it could collapse any year. Definitely once this event happens, we have to find different ways of providing ourselves with food. But we can't do that.
Not cannibalism.
No, not cannibalism. I mean, don't look at me when you say cannibalism. I'm totally not delicious. But one interesting possibility, and now this is really kind of hopeful. Humanity has encountered a disaster, but we're smart, we want to live. So okay, first thing we do is to figure out how to feed ourselves. All right, vertical farming. In other words, we grow our food in protected environments. We already do that to a fair extent. This can be expanded. That would certainly work. Estimates are that a vertical farm of 30 stories would be enough to provide food for about 50,000 people. So Seoul has a population of about, 20 million? Who can divide 50,000 to 20 million? That's what, 400? I'm terrible at this. But that's constructible in a fairly short amount of time. Now, in all of this, of course, I haven't talked about renewable energy. That, of course, was one of the magic bullets. If all of humanity on a wartime basis put wind and solar and what have you in place as fast as possible, we would probably fly. But even if, as I'm afraid is going to happen, we hit, in other words, the climate system shifts to a different phase, energy should be doable. We can do that. So we have food, we have energy. What's the other thing we need? Besides love, romance, and poetry and wine, what's the other thing we need? We need water, okay? So we've shifted into a new climate phase in which drought and mega drought is commonplace. I won't go into the reasons about why that is, but it's pretty straightforward. As again, I said, punctuated by times of violent storm. But what do we do about water? Well, one of the other angel technologies, if you will, that I think will deploy is water from air technology, because it's a twofer. There's the reason that we need the water, that it would be point of use. We don't have to build water infrastructure. It's dependable. But also, because increased temperatures have driven up the percentage of water vapor in the atmosphere, and water vapor is actually a more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. It's not the driver of global warming, it's a positive feedback which increases the rate of global warming. But what that means is that not only can we provide ourselves with water, but to the extent we extract it from the atmosphere, we reduce the amount of greenhouse gases. So that's the kind of technology which does two good things at once. So I think that's probably where we're going to be getting our water from. The thing though, and I'm coming toward the end here, I don't want to close on a less than hopeful note, but this is actually something that Emmanuel pointed out. The thing that does scare me the most is each other, because transitions so often devolve into chaos and fighting. In fact, a number of people say that there are existing conflicts on the planet which have already the finger of climate change in them. The Syrian civil war, the Arab Spring, certainly many of the conflicts in the Horn of Africa. So if we're going to, we in the wealthy world will probably have enough tools and money at our disposal to protect ourselves. But we're in the minority. And if we forget our brothers and sisters who didn't cause this, I don't think that we will stay safe behind our walls. And so part of the way in which we have to save ourselves is to find ways for them to shelter and prosper during the stormy time. The technology that we use will be applicable to them, and we need to make sure they have it. And the last technology that I want to mention, it's a favorite of mine, is the smart skin.
Smart.
Yes, we spend so much time worrying about getting cooler or hotter, and we spend prodigious amounts of energy to cool or heat spaces, I mean, particularly Americans. Fabrics now exist which you can wear, which are self-regulating in terms of temperature, which in fact recharge themselves. So I think, because we have created a new planet from the one we grew up on, we might start thinking ourselves as sort of stranded astronauts and use all of those technologies to the max. But again, we have to share them. So that's sort of what I had to say. I mean, my slides probably had more details, and any point that you would like technical details about or references, I'd be more than happy to share it. But I think sometimes keeping a simple, big picture in mind is the better way to proceed. So, we're all together in the vehicle. Sadly, we haven't stopped in time. We are going over the cliff. We could turn this falling vehicle into something that flies. There are ways to do it, but we're not going to do that in time. So we're going to hit. The good thing is that we will be able to survive if we don't forget each other. And I'm hopeful. Sometimes in war, as horrible as it is, we do find that the thing that we need most is each other. So that's it. Anybody has any questions? Yes.
Well, I really appreciate your great speech
Thank you.
today. And let me ask you, what are you going to do with this madman, who doesn't believe any report and analysis that the climate scientists bring up, and he's trying to carve, down.
Right. I've looked at analyses of his effect on efforts to stay below the 2-degree limit, which means it's meaningless. And it will have an effect. He has it within his power, the ability to abrogate the Paris Agreement on the part of the United States, and to not enforce what's called the Clean Air Act, which is the mechanism that the Obama administration has used to regulate emissions from power plants. And if we had more time before we go over this cliff, that would be really significant. But we're already too committed. So it's a horror story. But in essence, because we're so far away from where we need to be to really stop, it won't make a difference to that. That doesn't excuse his crime against humanity, and that's what it is. And I, again, as an American, I please accept my apologies that my country has, not risen to what it should have, given that it is the major historical emitter of greenhouse gases.
Yeah, I understand that, the last, Paris, climate convention was one of the major,
Welcome.
Big issue that all the countries in the world, agreed upon. But if Donald is going to break this agreement, then who's going to trust United States their policy?
No.
You shouldn't.
No.
In fact,
It's so
I
easy
will
to
go
say,
beyond that.
yeah.
We want to live, right? What is more sacred than preserving life for ourselves and for our children and for future generations? This is it. So you really, as the global community, and you're all now the 197 and 96 nations, you need to make the United States pay. You need to, at a minimum, put it. The United States, if he does that, is a rogue nation and is committed what is essentially a crime against humanity, and it needs to be treated in that way. I mean, there is such a thing as justice, and I would prefer that I wasn't living in an unjust country. But the fact of the matter is that I would plead with every other country on the planet to resist with
Right.
all that you can, because it's your life that's on the line, and our life that's on the line. You preserve us also. But again, diplomatically, Paris was beautiful. Copenhagen would have been better. It's not enough. Everybody knows it's not enough. So don't be lulled into a false sense of confidence by Paris. I'm sorry. Yes.
We have enough sufficient food in the world for 6 billion, 7 billion. But the thing is, the problem is we cannot distribute effectively to the various society, various countries. For example, in US, food wasted almost half of the food every year. So each means the half of food can be almost feed African continent, It means we have sufficient food and we have sufficient energy at the moment, but the proportion and distribution, how we spend the food and use, that is the problem in the world. And the world most energy, who made climate, air pollution, or still those rich countries, industrial countries, like US, West Europe, and Japan. And they are the most responsible. And they are rich because they absorb all the energy from around the world by gas or petrol or different energy, they absorb in different way and they use. But right now, Trump policies, Trump did not want to any responsible. He ran away for responsible and the leadership of the war. So U.S. should be considered they have responsible because they use a lot of energy and we share the same planet. So what is your opinion?
I absolutely completely agree with you. Getting back to that analogy, we're all in the same vehicle and it's speeding. And 20% of the people in the vehicle have 80% of the resources. It's a problem of massive inequality. And it's actually getting worse. In fact, last year, when I talked about this, I talked about the Oxfam report, which said that there were 62 individuals on the planet that had as much wealth as the bottom half of humanity. I was wrong. Oxfam went back and reanalyzed their data and realized that they had undercounted poverty in India and China. And in fact, there are 6 individuals, 6, that have as much wealth as the bottom half of humanity. So again, if we had time in this vehicle, that is probably the major thing that we would have to tackle. We would have to figure out how to share what we've got. And not only that, if we had time, if this vehicle wasn't going over this climate change cliff, I would come here today and I would say I am the most hopeful and happy man on the planet because quite frankly, in terms of the technologies that we now have, every child on the planet could have access to the best education, the best health care. All of their needs would be given to them. That's the capability we have now as humanity. We are so close. I don't say it would be a utopia because we're human beings. We'd always make some problems. But in terms of this problem, the problem of absolute poverty and absolute inequality, we've got the solutions. Not only do we have the solutions, but it's the best business opportunity in the world. That is where the real gold is. It's helping us all to live abundantly. There are 2 problems, though. The one problem is the one I've talked about. We don't have the time now. We've got the climate change abrupt shift cliff, which we've really gone over. Okay? And it's totally unfair because it was not caused by the people who are going to have the greatest impact. Although it's going to hit the rich countries too. They're not escaping this crap. If I haven't talked about sea level rise, but Hansen's paper last year in Journal of Atmospheric Chemistry and Physics said that we can have multi-meter sea level rise in starting as early as 2050. Now, it's a curve, so it might not multi-meter by 2050. But on top of that, if this sequence of runaway climate change, if this sequence of runaway climate change really has kicked in, then we're also facing the possible loss of the ice on Greenland. That's an extra 20 meters. Okay, now we'll lose that a little bit slower. But basically, we're talking about the loss of all of the world's coastal cities. So that's one problem with dealing with this massive criminal level of inequality. There's another issue, though, and this is going to take me into a segue, which is maybe going to distract us from what we need to do, but I'll go there a little bit. What's happening now, and this is what we talked about in the taxi, is really biologically very typical for an organism that is dominant. We find this all across the natural world that when a wolf or a coyote or a kind of a trilobite becomes very successful, it essentially kills itself because it takes over its supporting environment and it uses all the resources and then the population collapses. So you might think of Donald Trump as being evil incarnate, and I certainly do. But he is actually the face of a deeper type of evil, and that is the evil of overconsumption. The evil of us, essentially, you talked about cannibalism. What we're doing as a species is worse than cannibalism. At least in cannibalism, you're eating your friends, okay? Or maybe an honorable warrior that died in battle and you're eating their heart to give you courage. What we're doing as a species is we are devouring the body of our mother. And not only are we devouring the body of our mother, but actually, that mother still is what is feeding us at her breast. So as she feeds us, we are killing her. What could be worse than that? But we do not think that. There is a religion which has infected humanity, and it's called greed. There is one more, by the way, radical, incredibly radical and dangerous technology who I didn't mention, and I call it the inner game. It's the game that you play if you want to be happy. And you know what? It doesn't take many resources at all. A meal or two a day, a small room, candlelight, a simple life. And we have forgotten that in many ways, we would be happier if we all said, enough. Now I'm going to dream. Now I'm going to take time to be with my family and friends. Now I'm going to take walks in the mountains. But the system does not let us do it. But that is a technology which wouldn't cost anything. But I didn't mention it because it has all sorts of ramifications. But, you know, you're right. There's nothing I can say. I mean, all I would say is that we didn't know up to a certain point. We just thought we were making things better. We didn't realize that in the process of trying to make things better, we were doing irreparable harm to other nations and to ourselves. Doesn't excuse it, but that was the case.
One thing is the system, in our world, the global system is broken. Current system, neoliberalism, capitalism, it caused those things. Climate change or industrialization, inequality. Do you think it's
inequality has been with us through a number of economic systems.
Yes.
But what I particularly dislike about climate change is that it's a concealed fake religion. In other words, it claims to be rational, it claims to be based on solid economics, but in fact, what are called negative externalities. The real cost of climate change, the real cost of pollution, the real cost of social disruptions, you can go, there's a long list, are never calculated in its economics, but they're real. And so it's a fake economics, it's a Ponzi scheme, it's the economics of a vampire. Okay? If we had a real capitalism based on real economics, everything would be very different. You couldn't go out and rape the planet because you would know it's not worth it. So, but you're right, again, you're right.
I mean, my question is, do you see any alternative system? I think Trump is going to change system. Well, he really going to change capitalist system or neoliberalism, or he cannot change system?
There are a large number of possible candidates, all worthy of consideration and trial. One of the beautiful things about this planet is there isn't one right answer. There are multiple parallel ways of living on the planet, and what's cool is that they interact with each other in a way, form a big ecosystem. So I'm not sure if I want to say this is the right way to do it. Again, if we had the time, I think technology would radically liberate us, because pretty soon we're all going to be, if this cliff wasn't there, we could all live incredibly rich lives with robot servants, living in our gardens with lots of leisure time to paint and write poetry. It's doable. The problem then is, how do you distribute this wealth? So you have kind of a utopian robotic socialism.
I don't agree about technology will liberate everything, because technology is just technology, but they don't have conscience. They don't know which is right and how to make fair, how to make justice. Because during the past 50 years ago, technology changed big inequality. Like the Microsoft, because of technology, he profit a lot. So technology
itself is not the evil. It's the people.
Yeah,
I mean,
you're
I don't
right.
believe
a,
it can-
a knife is technology, and
It
you can
cannot
use it to
evaporate.
kill, or you can use it to.
It's
I
slice
agree
your
with
cabbage.
I do agree with
but
I take your point.
I mean,
you're
technology
right.
is
It's how
not
we
bad.
apply
I
it and
mean,
use it.
technology is not bad, but I mean, technology cannot itself liberate everything. The things, the system
Well,
is.
there's always the potential for liberation, even if you're in a cage, even if you're a prisoner, because vastness and true freedom really is a matter of attitude. Okay? But let's look at what you're saying about technology. Technology, in another way, is driving us because it's out of control and it's in the hands of people who are becoming rich and more powerful out of it. It's driving us into, again, a different kind of a world, over another kind of a cliff. Some people see it as a dystopian future. Other people see it as a hopeful future. What's the difference? The difference is the extent to which we have control of our choices about how to use this technology. But it can be said that, again, if we don't destroy ourselves, that we are on the verge of a post-human generation in which, again, a huge range of possibilities, in which since we now know the language of life, in which we're able to create what we want, since we now are so close in terms of man-machine interface that it's going to be a seamless. I mean, we're stuck in our smartphones now. That's nothing. This is primitive. This is a rock in a cave. In a very short time, again, if we don't go over this cliff, each of us will be essentially, if we want to be, embedded in a series of virtual worlds which are realer than this. Because this is a simulation. This is something our brain has manufactured to represent to us in one certain way what we're confusing as reality. We already live essentially in a bio-virtual reality. And that's just the beginning if we survive. Is that good? Is that bad? Is it going to make us happy? It's up to us. I would say I'm a little bit of a pessimist because, again, these changes are not in the hands of necessarily good people. They tend to be in the hands of people who are a little bit divorced from humanity, a little bit greedy, sometimes not very empathetic, often sociopathic.
But
Do you
that's,
think that being sociopathic leads to those people being in those roles?
Yes.
Or being in those roles makes
Yes,
us-
studies
or
seem to confirm that's the case. And I'm not saying there isn't a role for sociopathy in the human population, but in terms of the happiness of society, to give them all of the power, I think,
So is
is
it not
dangerous.
possible for people with like good morals and good ethics to be in positions of power?
Of course it is, yes, of course it is.
but I think there is something in the.
I think it has to do with you. I'm sorry.
No.
This guy's got the answers. He's
Well,
just,
it's a very
he's just being
interesting-
quiet and letting me. And I like the guy over here who's with the glasses, who's crossing his arms. I've got a feeling there's a lot that I've said that you disagree with. So I want to hear. Oh, okay.
So
You didn't miss anything. Trust me.
No, I missed the whole slideshow.
Well,
We
We
had
missed
a
that
vote
too.
and we decided not to do it.
Oh, my question was, you said this cliff and all the cities on either coast will be eliminated or something. My question was, when's this gonna happen?
Right.
Maybe you already said that.
So I like Hansen's modeling because he really attempts to incorporate nonlinear feedbacks. The computer modeling, it's sort of garbage in, garbage out. There's a British, I don't remember now if he's a physicist or not, but he gives the metaphor. It's a beautiful story if I can remember it. There's a bunch of scientists who hear about an animal called a cheetah. So they go to their supercomputers. They have a description of it. They model it in their supercomputer. They come out and they say, okay, we've got this figured out. This cheetah has a top speed of 30 miles per hour. And they're very confident because the modeling is good, best supercomputers in the world. You can look clearly at what the calculations are. There's no doubt. The cheetah's top speed is 30 miles an hour.
I thought it was 60 miles.
And then you're ruining the story. And then the people from the field come back, and this is the analogy is to the paleoclimatic researchers come out and say, we've clocked this beast 70 miles an hour at peak. And that's kind of what's happening in terms of me being able to answer or not. The best modeler of the nonlinear effects, I think it's Hansen and people like them who assume a high level of Earth system sensitivity. That particular type of sea level rise could hit us as early as 2050. That's multi-meter by 2050. It could be by the end of the century. Definitely by the end of the century, according to those estimates, multi-meter sea level rise, okay? What I'm saying, and what other people are pointing out, is that there is just so much uncertainty in the system that even an attempt to model it with knowledge of nonlinear feedbacks is probably missing a lot. And to the extent you follow the rapidity with which every Earth system is degrading, I would not be surprised if it actually comes quicker, okay? Every time a new report comes out on the rate at which the Antarctic is calving or the rate at which Greenland is fissuring, the scientists say, we've never seen it this fast. They keep moving that estimate earlier. But yeah, let's say that.
Yeah.
So are we gonna, let's say it's 2050, 6 feet, 9 feet. Are we gonna be ready by then? Potentially, we can figure out how to make our cities float. Potentially, some of the richest cities will find ways of protecting themselves. But if it's 2 meters, this is higher than the dikes in Holland. The Dutch, you know how the Dutch, the experts of living with the ocean, you know what they've decided about sea level rise? They say they can't defend against it. They say. They basically are like some of the Pacific Islands are looking for real estate they can buy elsewhere.
What are some other examples of where we've grossly miscalculated by using linear models?
Oh, that's a very, very good question. So I've mostly been looking at the Arctic. Other, I would say, gross miscalculations in terms of the actual rate of degradation that we're seeing have to do with loss of forests, the Amazon, and this isn't just climate change. It also has to do with the rate of deforestation. But the Amazon is tipping on the edge of becoming a carbon source. The Amazon, which is our greatest carbon sink in terms of forestry, is incredible danger. Part of it is climate change. But the other finger of it is the deforestation, because, and this is really interesting, the greatest amounts of water that reach the interior of continents are passed along by the trees, by living vegetation, I should say. The rain mostly falls in coastal areas, and it's less the farther inland you go. And the vegetation transpires. It's this beautiful, beautiful symphony of releasing their water vapor back into the atmosphere. It moves along, it rains again on the next bunch of vegetation. They transpire. So they form this living conduit of water into the interiors. And because of the cutting of the Amazon, many of those living water conduits have been cut. So that's the other thing I look at. I can see it in my country, the loss of forests, which in ways which were totally not monitored, not predicted by climate change models. I used to be a skier, so I used to live in Colorado. I love the mountains, used to climb. And as of 5 or 6 years ago, when I went back to Colorado, I would cry because the trees are dying up in the mountains. Why? Well, there's been a long ongoing battle between the borer beetle and the pine tree. And usually winter saved the trees, because when it got cold and there were heavy snows, the beetle would die. And then the tree would, make it to the next year. Then the battle would begin again. But because the weather is a little bit warmer, sometimes a great deal warmer, the winters are too mild, the beetle's surviving, and it's killed hundreds of millions of hectares of forest. You just drive, and slope after slope, they're brown, decaying, dying, dead. That's loss of another climate, of another carbon sink, by the way. This is happening all across the planet. So that was a major prediction, which was a major nonlinear, because it's a nonlinear shift, totally unpredicted. I would say another one was the rapidity with which we can tip over into a drought. California now is getting major, heavy inundations of rain, but it's probably in the States, everything west of Kansas City. I don't know how much you guys can picture that. But the western half of the country probably will be in a mega drought. Probably has begun already, despite these rains. Mega droughts have happened in the past. We know what they're like in that part of the country. They last for 100 years. Doesn't mean sometimes you won't get crazy rain, because now the weather patterns are so chaotic that in some ways we don't know what's going to happen. That's something that came, although we knew it was possible, it really did come much quicker than we had hoped, what we had anticipated. In other words, these changes, you get a point, it's kind of normal, it's not too bad, it's a little bit different, and then it's changed, it's different, it's no longer the way it was. It's nonlinear, it's radical, it's abrupt. That's happening all over the world in most ecosystems. They're losing their robustness. The only other one, and the slide does it, but I don't know if I should try to explain. That's why I won't, because it'll just be me waving my hands, which, is fun to do, but it's not going to clear things up. The other thing has to do with the way the jet stream is changing. The jet stream goes around the planet up and down, up and down, up and down. On one side of these are called Rossby waves. On one side you're getting rain, on the other side it's dry. That's the progression of those waves around the planet is basically the progression of weather patterns. I mean, the monsoon system is a little bit more complicated. Although, by the way, I wouldn't be surprised if the monsoon, East Asian and South Asian monsoon, collapsed any year. Most climate scientists won't say it could happen that quick, but we keep getting surprised, so who knows? It's definitely been altered already. But that system is weakening, and so it's slowing down, and the waves are sometimes getting blocked. And when they get blocked, on one side the rains just keep coming. And on the other side it gets dry, 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 and hot. This happened in 2010 in Russia and Pakistan. On one side of this blocked front, Pakistan experienced torrential rains over the course of a couple days, which destroyed about 40 years of development. Half the country was flooded. You're remembering the incident. What people forget is that this was linked to the other side of the front, where Russia had fires, which they had never had before. So bad that there were hundreds of people who lost their life, and maybe thousands, I forgot the figure, but they stopped exporting grain to the rest of the world. And as a result of that, bread prices in the Arab world went up, and people started rioting. A Tunisian baker set himself on fire, and the Arab Spring started. So little effects can have big effects. We're also interlinked. And that's, again, why I think we're concerned about not just the geophysical dimension of dealing with this set of challenges, but maybe even the greater dimension, since humanity up to this time hasn't been really good at it, of really caring for each other.
So will it repeat again? Second World War, like Hitler leadership style?
There is little doubt in my mind
He's not
that
good guy.
the rise in right-wing nationalism in Europe and the United States is linked to climate change. And what do I mean by that? The Syrian civil war has the figures of climate change all over it. There was a 500-year drought in Syria. Young farmers left the villages, they went to the city. the system was corrupt, they couldn't find work, and their eyes were opened as to what was really going on, they peeled off. Some of them were radicalized by a form of political Islam. Others were armed and trained by the CIA to try and take down. But in other words, if the drought had not been there, they would never have left their farms. They never would have succumbed to the siren song of war. And then you have these. How many refugees now from Syria? 2, 3, 4, 5 million. I'm sorry. These are human beings just like us.
4 million in Turkey.
All right, and
1 million in Palestine, 1 million in
and how many
Jordan.
made it to Europe? Very few, right?
Oh, I guess more than a million.
Altogether, and the United States that was complicit in this, obviously, took very few. But that's all it took. 1 million, give or take a few 100,000 well-meaning refugees in rich countries, and suddenly people didn't want any more, and they started electing nuts. Trump, all of even the European countries have Trump-like right-wing nationalists. So unfortunately, given, again, the idea, the probability that once this hits, the number of climate change refugees is going to swell into the hundreds of millions. How are we going to react? Again, most people are going to shut their doors and start shooting. I'm going to protect me and mine and us, and they can go to hell. That's what my country is doing. The Mexican immigrants. You know what I'm going to say? Climate change has played a role in that. Climate change is already making it harder for sustenance farmers to survive in Mexico and Central America. Did they cause it? No, we did. They can't farm anymore. They're trying to survive. They're trying to take care of their children. All right, well, I don't particularly like America, but I'm going to try and go there and make enough money to survive, to support my family. So in a way, we caused climate change. It caused them to leave their farms. They came to our country because they had no place else to go, and that's created Trump, who's now going to build a big wall to keep them out. It's all interconnected and not in a healthy way.
Well, thank you for sharing your afternoon with us.
Thank you for listening.
In terms of individual behavior and perhaps government policy, what prescriptions have you come across?
This is the question I hate the most.
Because
So it's like, I'm saying we're all going to die, and so then you're saying, well, what should we do?
Because in Korea, for me example, I say, oh, let's talk about climate change, and we have a saying, 배부른 소리 하지 말아라. It means, so you're not worrying about your next meal, so don't bother me. I'm studying. I have a job to do. Don't approach me with this. And everybody's turned off. People say, oh, you Koreans like to eat gogi, right? So, 고기 먹어, 고기 먹어.
Yeah.
So nobody's thinking I should, reduce my, meat consumption.
Yeah.
We like to drive big cars. We become industrialized. I want to show off my, 10,000 cc, luxury car, rather than walk and take the subway. So I try to change and want to do things, but I feel as, oh, it's the U.S., it's not me, something like that, right? So we can all make a change, but I'm not too sure is what I can really do, because I have limitations in my ability and reach and whatnot. And so I don't know. I just want to, because you've obviously have been into this field longer than me. I just want to know, especially government. I want to. Maybe have you seen countries where they have like a special, not an excise tax, but to tax the rich on luxury? If you can afford it, and if you're, can that be a viable thing?
A lot of the economists at this previous seminar in Shanghai, that was what they felt was the most useful tool, was a carbon tax. That would certainly begin to adjust the playing field, so that we would begin to encourage people to reduce things which were connected with more greenhouse gas emission. The tax could be given directly back to people. I think that's good thing to consider. I mean, here and there are versions of it being put in place. More often than not, they try carbon markets, which the success of those doesn't seem to be so good. It seems that people find a way to game it. So, ironically, and I'm not an expert about Korean government policy vis-a-vis climate change, but the little bit that I remember seeing, I think you should congratulate yourselves. I think there are a lot of good things at a high level that the Korean government is doing or thinking about doing or aware of. I know, for example, getting back to food security, that the USDA, U.S. Department of Agriculture, with a little bit of cooperation with them, but that basically the Korean version of that has a research facility on Jeju-do, where they are trying to see what plants will grow under different climatic conditions, so that when the climate changes, and it will be possible to substitute. So I know that Seoul, and I don't know if I get this right, so correct me, that the carbon credits that their government buildings were generating by going greener were being used for social equity, so that poorer families were able to afford solar panels, for example. This is something which is interesting if there is a way to institutionalize that approach worldwide, so that we subsidize solar panels for people in Chad or Benin or where have you. That's a kind of a interesting approach. I know it's not so far out, but right now in the States, if you can't for whatever reason put solar panels on your house, you can buy energy from someplace where they have wind and solar. And theoretically, this is something that we could do worldwide. This is something theoretically a farmer in Zaire or Mozambique could do on their cell phone. In other words, we could link everybody into this effort to be greener, using what technologies we have available. And there's a lot of innovative thought in that way. But your basic question kind of gets at exactly the dilemma and why we are where we are. Human beings don't seem to be able to react with enough panic to something that's not hitting them in the face. And although this, in geological terms, and even in terms of human terms, this is happening super fast, it's not happening fast enough for us to panic the way we should.
So the thing who will shoot?
So,
Not
listen,
Korea.
I think because of for time limits, I'll end the formal part of this seminar now. So thank you very much, Daniel, for an excellent discussion of a very critical issue. And everyone is free, of course, to informally mingle hereafter. Thank you again.
Thank you very much. We can just go and eat, enjoy what's left of the evening, whatever you guys like. But you guys are awesome. Thank you for being so patient with my little talk.
Thank you.
So did you show slides or not?
The few of us who were here a little bit earlier, we talked about it and we voted and decided
언제 들어왔어요?